8 years, man. 8 years of marriage, 2 beautiful kids, Jack 6 and Olivia 5, and what I thought was a solid foundation. We were that couple people would look at and say, they've got it together. Beth, my wife. She's always been incredible with the kids. She's the glue of the family. A supermom who made every holiday, every birthday, everything special. I was completely in love with her, even after all these years. We didn't have a perfect marriage. Who does? But I felt lucky, like I'd found a partner for life. Or so I thought. I guess there were some signs I ignored. For example, Beth got really secretive with her phone lately. She'd always had her phone lying around, but now it was like it was glued to her hand. She'd tilt it away or step out of the room when a notification popped up. I asked her once, jokingly, if she had a boyfriend at work, and she laughed it off, calling me paranoid. She said she was helping out a coworker, Kevin, who was going through a tough time, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? That's just who I am, trusting. Trusting to a fault, I guess. Then, one weekend, we had family over for Olivia's birthday. It was a good day, full of laughter, family, and the usual chaos of kids running around. At one point, Beth was showing me some pictures on her phone, and I saw a text come in. It said, "I love you more." I froze, staring at those words on her screen, not understanding at first. My stomach dropped, but I convinced myself it was harmless, maybe just a close friend being affectionate. I asked her casually, "Who's that?" She brushed it off, saying it was from Kevin, the coworker, and that they had this silly thing where they tried to outdo each other with friendly messages. "Just a little boost for him," she said. And then she flashed me a smile like I was silly for even asking. I wanted to believe her, and I did, mostly. The day after Olivia's birthday, we were putting things away, dealing with the aftermath of a weekend filled with family, cake, and balloons. It was late, the kids were asleep, and there was this strange, tense energy in the house. I was exhausted, but Beth had this look on her face, like she was wrestling with something inside. Finally, as we sat down on the couch, she took a deep breath and said, "I need to tell you something." My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it couldn't be good. I tried to brace myself, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. She told me that she hadn't been honest about the text I'd seen. It wasn't just some harmless inside joke with a coworker. In fact, she admitted that the message wasn't from Kevin at all. She said it was from someone else, a friend she'd gotten close to over the past few months. My stomach twisted, and a part of me already knew where this was going. I could feel the foundation of our life together cracking beneath me. She went on, telling me that she had accidentally developed feelings for someone else and had fallen for him in a way she hadn't expected. I remember her words exactly. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but it just did. We connected and it felt easy. Easy." She said that while I'd been busy with work and the kids, this guy had become someone she could talk to, laugh with, and just escape with. I sat there trying to process it, but the words kept coming. She said they hadn't been intimate yet, at least not physically, but that she was in love with him, that she felt alive with him. The emotional knife twisted deeper with every word she spoke. It was surreal. Here I was, listening to the woman I'd built a life with tell me that some other man, someone she refused to even name, had her heart. She talked about how it had just happened, how she wasn't looking for it, but that life was too short not to be happy. She said it so casually, like it was a minor inconvenience for us to deal with. I just sat there, stunned, my mind racing back to every moment we'd spent together, every memory, every promise. How did we get here? When did our life together become something she wanted to escape? And worse, how could she sit there, looking me in the eyes, and justify it? She didn't seem sorry. She seemed almost relieved, like she was finally getting this off her chest and could move on with her new life. At one point, I asked her, "So, what does this mean for us?" I could barely get the words out. My voice was shaking, my head spinning. I felt like I was floating outside of myself, watching this all happen to someone else. She looked at me, almost with pity, and said, "I think I need time to figure out what I want." She actually suggested that we spend some time apart, just to see if maybe this other relationship was what she truly wanted. It was like our marriage, our family, everything we built was just optional for her now. I didn't even have the strength to argue or fight back. I was numb, trying to absorb the impact of everything she'd just thrown at me. She kept talking about finding herself and needing space to grow. I'd heard people say these kinds of things before, but I never thought I'd hear them from my own wife. She talked about how she felt like she'd been suffocating in our marriage, like I'd somehow trapped her, held her back. And here I was, thinking we were happy or at least content. In the days that followed, I started noticing all the little things I'd ignored. The late nights working at the office, the sudden interest in going out with friends, the new clothes, the extra attention to her appearance. I realized painfully that she'd been pulling away from me for a while, and I'd been too blind, too trusting to see it. I went through a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, disbelief, sadness. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I felt like a ghost in my own life, wandering through the ruins of what I thought was a happy marriage. One night, I finally cracked. I went into our shared phone account and started looking through the call logs, texts, anything that could give me a clue. And that's when I saw it. A number I didn't recognize. One that she'd been texting almost every day for the past 6 months. Hundreds of messages, dozens of calls, all hours of the day and night. My hands shook as I scrolled through the records. The confirmation was right there, staring me in the face. Eventually, I found his name, Mike Carson. He was our son's soccer coach. I'd met him a few times at the games, even shook his hand. He'd seemed friendly enough, and he'd always talked to me like we were on the same team, both cheering Jack on. Now, all I could think about was how he must have been laughing behind my back the whole time. The betrayal felt personal on a level I'd never known. Not only had my wife lied to me, but she'd done it with someone I'd trusted around my kids. When I confronted her about Mike, she tried to lie again. She said they were just friends, that he was going through a hard time, and that she was just being there for him. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually she stopped denying it. Her face changed from defensive to cold, almost indifferent, as she said, "You were the one who pushed me away. I needed something you weren't giving me." The woman I'd loved, who I'd thought was my best friend, had become someone I didn't even recognize, and she was blaming me for it all. I felt anger, raw and blinding, but beneath that was something worse, an emptiness that I didn't know how to fill. I was trapped in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from, and the woman who I'd thought would always stand by me had become the monster in it. That night, after discovering everything, I was a wreck. I couldn't even look at Beth without feeling like my chest was going to collapse. I wanted answers, explanations, maybe even an apology, something to make sense of the mess she'd created. But every time I tried to bring it up, she'd deflect, claiming I was dwelling on the past or refusing to let her be happy. She'd twist it, somehow making me the villain for not accepting her need to grow. It was surreal, watching the woman I'd known and loved become so distant, so cold. I decided I had to confront her again, really dig into the why, the how. I couldn't just sit there and let her blame me, paint herself as the victim of a marriage that she'd actively chosen to destroy. So, I set up the conversation in a way that forced her to listen, choosing a night when the kids were with my sister so we wouldn't have to keep our voices down. I needed to hear her, unfiltered, to understand what had really happened to the woman I'd once trusted more than anyone. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had family dinners, planned vacations, made memories. It felt almost sick to bring this here, to taint that space, but I needed her to know I was serious. I told her I was done with the excuses, done with the blame game, that I wanted the truth, no more just friends nonsense, no more vague explanations. And that's when she really let loose. She told me that, honestly, she'd felt dead in our marriage for years, like she was just going through the motions. "You've been holding me back," she said, like it was my fault she'd turned our lives upside down. According to her, Mike made her feel free, alive. All those cliches I'd heard in movies and never thought I'd hear directed at me. It was infuriating, heartbreaking, but above all, confusing. This was the same woman who'd once told me I was her soulmate, that she'd never wanted anything more than to build a life with me. I asked her what she thought would happen with our family, with the kids. Did she just expect me to sit back while she chased this freedom she felt with Mike? Her response was as cold as ice. She said, "Maybe you're just too afraid of change. Maybe the kids and I would be better off if you weren't holding us down." That line hit me like a punch to the gut. She turned me, a man who'd done everything to give her and the kids a stable life, into the enemy. I could feel my hands clenching, my voice rising. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that she was free to leave if she wanted this new life so badly. But she had to decide. She couldn't keep holding our family hostage, stringing me along while playing house with someone else. She rolled her eyes, like I was the one being unreasonable. She said I was making everything dramatic, that I was overreacting. "It's not like I slept with him," she kept insisting. "We just talk. We have a connection, something you wouldn't understand." The word connection felt like acid. How could she not see what she was doing? She was rewriting our history, turning our life into some prison that she was desperate to escape from. I reminded her of everything we'd built together, the years we'd spent loving each other, the dreams we'd had for our family. Her response? "Dreams change. People change. I've outgrown us, and maybe you need to accept that." Her words felt calculated, sharp, each one a dagger she was driving deeper into the heart of our marriage. I asked her, "Did it even matter to you, Beth? Did any of it matter?" She looked at me, unfazed, and said, "It did, but that was a long time ago." I was stunned into silence. She wasn't crying, wasn't remorseful, nothing. It was like she'd turned her heart off, and I was looking at a stranger. She got up from the table, like the conversation was over, like there was nothing left to discuss. She even had the audacity to ask if I'd be okay watching the kids over the weekend, so she could clear her head and figure things out. Couldn't believe it. I asked her point blank, "Are you still seeing him?" She sighed, annoyed, and said, "I don't know, maybe. If I am, it's none of your business now." Then she stormed out of the room, leaving me there, crushed, holding on to whatever was left of my pride. After she left, I sat there in silence, just replaying her words in my head. It was all so clear now. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even conflicted. She had rewritten our story in her mind, turned me into the bad guy, and cast herself as some martyr who deserved better. It was maddening, watching her twist reality to justify everything she'd done. And the worst part? I was still in love with her. Despite everything, a part of me still wanted to fix things, to somehow make her see what she was doing, to remind her of who we'd once been together. It felt pathetic, clinging to the idea of a woman who'd already walked away emotionally, if not physically. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. I remembered all the times she'd been working late or out with friends, wondering if those had just been excuses to see him. I felt like a fool, and that shame cut deeper than I could ever have imagined. The next morning I made a decision. I was done letting her play with my heart, done allowing her to tear me down so she could justify her affair. I called a lawyer, set up a consultation. I didn't know if I could actually go through with a divorce, but I needed to know my options. I needed to take back some control, even if just a sliver. When I told her about the lawyer, she laughed. Actually laughed, and said, "Good luck, then." She didn't even care. No attempt to talk me out of it, no fight, no remorse. Just that same cold indifference, as if our life together had been nothing more than a phase she'd outgrown. I had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go on like this, letting her tear me apart bit by bit. She'd made her choice, and now, for my own sanity, I had to start making mine. Over the next few days, I moved like a robot, just going through the motions of life. I got the kids ready for school, went to work, tried to keep up appearances, but inside, I was numb. Every time I looked at Beth, it felt like a knife twisting deeper. She went on with her life as if nothing had changed, smiling, chatting with friends on the phone, even humming while cooking dinner. It was eerie, like she'd compartmentalized the destruction of our marriage into a box she didn't need to deal with. One night, after I'd put the kids to bed, she approached me casually and said she needed to talk. I braced myself, hoping, maybe foolishly, that she'd finally express some kind of regret, some acknowledgement of the hurt she'd caused. But instead, she told me she'd decided to move out for a while. She said she needed space to figure things out, and thought it would be healthier for everyone if she spent some time on her own. I just stared at her, dumbfounded. She wasn't suggesting this so we could work on ourselves or even our marriage. No, this was her way of creating a buffer between us while she pursued whatever fantasy she was living out. I asked her, trying to keep my voice calm, "And what about the kids? Do you think they'll understand why Mom's moving out?" She shrugged, barely affected, and said, "They'll adjust. It's better for them in the long run if we're both happy." That line, it felt like an insult. Here she was, tearing their family apart, and she had the nerve to frame it as if it was in their best interest. After she packed up her things over the next few days, she didn't even have a real explanation for the kids, just some rehearsed lines about needing a little break. Jack and Olivia looked at her with these big, confused eyes, trying to make sense of why Mom was leaving. Watching her kiss them goodbye like she was just going on a vacation was more than I could handle. I barely held it together until she walked out the door. When she was gone, I broke down. The kids were in bed, the house was quiet, and it hit me with full force. She was gone, and she'd left without looking back. The next few days were a blur of sadness and rage. I think about her with him, laughing, enjoying herself, living this double life while I was stuck here, trying to pick up the pieces for the kids. My lawyer advised me to document everything, to protect myself. I started combing through phone records, old messages, anything that might shed light on what had really happened. It was during one of those late-night sessions that I stumbled upon something that ripped open a wound I didn't even know I had. I found a message from her that was dated 5 years ago. It was buried in her email archives, sent to an address I didn't recognize, and the subject line read, "It's time to move on." I opened it, heart pounding, and there it was. A confession, sent to a friend, describing her desire to leave me. She'd written that she'd wanted to walk away from our marriage for years, but had held back because of the kids. She even mentioned that she was only staying with me because of a health scare that had made her realize she couldn't go through it alone. All this time, she'd been keeping me around not out of love, but out of convenience. I felt sick to my stomach. The reality of it all came crashing down on me. She hadn't just betrayed me now. She'd been harboring resentment, planning her exit, and hiding her true feelings for years. I'd been in love with a woman who was only going through the motions, biding her time until it was convenient to leave. And now that she'd found someone else, she felt emboldened enough to finally make her escape. Fueled by anger, I confronted her about the email. I told her I knew she'd been planning to leave me long before Mike came along, that she'd been lying to me for years. She didn't deny it. In fact, she had the gall to tell me, "Well, now you know. Maybe this will make it easier for you to move on." That was it. No remorse, no apology. Just a cold confirmation that I'd been nothing more than a placeholder in her life. Someone to support her until she found a better option. My anger boiled over. I told her that if she was so desperate to be free, she could have it. I wouldn't stand in her way. I told her I'd fight for custody of the kids, that I'd make sure they were safe and loved, even if that meant they'd never know her true colors. She scoffed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. She actually had the nerve to say, "You're overreacting. I'll always be their mother. This is just something I need to do for me." I realized, in that moment, that the woman I'd loved was gone, or maybe she'd never truly been there at all. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner, for ignoring all the red flags. This woman, this stranger, didn't care about the life we'd built, the family we'd created. She only cared about herself, about satisfying whatever whim or thrill she thought would make her feel alive. I told her I wanted her out of the house for good. I was done playing nice, done letting her use me while she pretended to figure things out. She looked at me like I was being dramatic, but for the first time, I didn't care. I knew what I had to do, not just for me, but for the kids. I wasn't going to let them grow up watching their father get treated like a doormat, seeing love twisted into something disposable. That night, I called my lawyer again. I told him I was ready to file for divorce, to start the process of separating our lives once and for all. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be fallout, that the kids would have questions, but I was done being her fallback plan. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. After that night, everything changed. Beth moved out for good, and I finally felt some relief mixed in with the heartbreak. The house felt emptier. Sure, but I had my kids, and I threw myself into making life as normal as possible for them. I set up routines, made sure Jack and Olivia felt safe and loved. It wasn't easy, far from it. Every time I saw one of Beth's old things lying around, it was like reliving the betrayal all over again. But I kept moving forward, step by painful step. I'd reached a sort of grim acceptance when, out of the blue, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was a spam call. But they called again, and something told me to answer. I picked up, and there was a pause on the other end before I heard her voice. Beth. It had been 5 years since I'd last heard from her. 5 years since she'd left, since we'd signed the divorce papers and parted ways. She hadn't made any effort to keep in touch aside from the necessary coordination for the kids. She'd been living her life, presumably with Mike, and I'd slowly started to rebuild mine. But now, out of nowhere, she was calling me. My heart pounded, a flood of old emotions rushing back. Anger, hurt, confusion. "Hi," she said quietly, almost as if she was hesitant. She sounded different, like something was weighing on her. I could hear the sound of traffic in the background, the faint hum of a city street. I could hardly believe it. "What do you want, Beth?" I kept my voice as steady as I could, unwilling to let her hear how rattled I felt. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "I know it's been a long time, and I know I have no right to call you, but I needed to talk to you." She paused again, her voice wavering. "There's something I need you to know." I stood there, unsure of whether to hang up or let her speak. Part of me didn't want to hear a single word she had to say, but the other part, the part that had never fully healed, needed closure. So, I let her continue, though every instinct screamed at me to end the call. "I didn't leave you because of Mike," she said, and the words hung in the air like a bomb. I scoffed, the disbelief and anger bubbling up instantly. "Is that supposed to make me feel better, Beth? 5 years later, you're calling me to rewrite history? What's the point?" She didn't rise to my anger. Her voice was quiet, almost pleading. "No, I know I can't undo anything, but I need you to know why. It's because I was sick, really sick. I had a health scare back then, something I didn't think I could tell you about. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you stuck with me, bound by some sense of obligation or pity." Her words faltered, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath on the other end. I didn't know what to say. Part of me thought this was just another excuse, a new manipulation to make herself feel better. But something in her voice, for the first time in years, she sounded genuine. Vulnerable, even. I'd never heard her like this, and that made it even harder to process. "What kind of sickness?" I managed to ask, my voice cold. She hesitated, then said, "I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease. At first, it was just fatigue and random pain, but it got worse. The doctors didn't know how bad it would get. And I panicked. I didn't want to be a burden to you or the kids. And when I met Mike, it was like an escape, a way to pretend everything was normal. To pretend I could just run away from it all." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "Obviously, I made a mess of everything. But I thought if you hated me, it'd be easier for you." My mind was reeling. All these years, I'd believed she left out of selfishness, that she'd walked away because she wanted a new life without us. And now she was telling me it was because she was sick, because she didn't want to be a burden? It was like everything I'd held on to, everything I'd used to justify my anger, was suddenly slipping through my fingers. "Beth," I started, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "You could have told me. We could have faced it together. That's what marriage is. You don't get to just make that decision for both of us." My voice cracked, and I hated that she could still make me feel this way after all this time. She was silent, and I could hear the faint sound of her crying. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I needed you to know. It's been eating away at me for years. I wanted to tell you, but I thought it was too late. I thought you'd moved on." I sat down, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. It was hard to breathe. The anger I'd clung to for so long was mixing with a strange, hollow sadness. I'd spent years hating her, resenting her, using that anger to rebuild myself. And now I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to scream at her, tell her she'd ruined everything and left me to pick up the pieces alone. But another part of me, the part that remembered how much I'd once loved her, felt nothing but sorrow. Finally, I said, "Beth, I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what this is supposed to fix." She took a shaky breath. "I don't want anything, not really. I just needed you to know. And I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it's too late, but I'm sorry." The conversation lingered in the air, unresolved, full of words that would never truly mend the damage. I couldn't bring myself to say I forgave her. Maybe I would one day, but that day wasn't today. I told her goodbye, and as I hung up, a strange peace washed over me. It was a heavy, bittersweet kind of peace, but for the first time, I felt like I could truly start to let go. That night, I looked at old photos at the family we used to be, and I let myself mourn it all over again. But this time, there was no bitterness, just a quiet, somber acceptance that things hadn't been as simple as I'd thought. In the days after that phone call, I felt a kind of heaviness I hadn't felt in years, but it wasn't the sharp, all-consuming anger that used to fuel me. It was quieter, a deep, settling sadness that made me confront the love I once had for Beth, the love I'd buried under layers of resentment. For years, I'd held onto this idea of her as the villain, the cold-hearted person who'd betrayed our family. But now, knowing her reasons, even if they didn't justify her actions, complicated everything. I tried not to dwell on it, focusing on the kids and work, but there was no escaping the past now. That night, I did something I hadn't done since the divorce. I went through a box of old memories I'd shoved into the back of the closet. There were photos, letters, anniversary cards we'd exchanged. Each one felt like peeling back a scar, exposing old wounds I thought had healed. I read her letters from when we first started dating, where she'd written about wanting to grow old together, about dreaming of a family. In that moment, it was like the Beth I used to know was in the room with me again, the version of her that had loved me, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. I remembered that love with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself to feel since she'd left. One letter in particular stopped me in my tracks. It was from the early days of our marriage, and she'd written about how scared she was of losing me, about how our love was the one thing in her life that felt certain. I wondered when that certainty had started to crack, when her fears turned inward, isolating her until she chose to face them alone. I could see now that she'd been struggling for a long time, maybe long before she ever met Mike or made the decision to leave. And while I didn't excuse her actions, I understood them in a way I hadn't before. The next day, I made an appointment with my therapist, someone I hadn't seen in years. I needed to process this, to make sense of the mix of anger, empathy, and grief churning inside me. As I sat there explaining everything, my therapist listened quietly before finally saying, "Sometimes people make terrible choices out of fear." It sounds like Beth was terrified, and in trying to escape that fear, she created even more pain. But you don't have to carry that pain for her anymore. That line hit me hard. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of her betrayal, letting it shape me, letting it define how I saw love and trust. But now, with everything out in the open, I could feel myself beginning to let it go. Over the next few weeks, I slowly started to reclaim my life in a way that felt different from before. I focused on my kids, poured my energy into creating new memories with them, memories that weren't haunted by the past. Jack and Olivia had grown so much in the years since Beth left, and I was determined to be the father they deserved, the kind of father who could show them that love doesn't always have to end in pain. And then, one evening, I received another call. This time, it wasn't from Beth but from Mike, the man she'd left me for. I didn't want to pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was nervous, unsure, as he introduced himself and stumbled through an apology. He said he was reaching out because he'd recently found out about Beth's illness, and he was devastated. Apparently, things hadn't worked out between them. They'd broken up a year after she left me, and he had since moved on, but he hadn't known about her health issues until recently. Hearing the regret in his voice brought an unexpected sense of relief. Not joy, not satisfaction, but relief. Knowing that she had suffered consequences for her choices, that she hadn't simply found happiness at my expense, gave me a strange sense of closure. He told me that he'd spent years regretting what happened, wishing he'd never gotten involved. I listened, numb, as he tried to explain himself, as if words could somehow erase the hurt he'd caused. But I wasn't angry anymore. I told him simply, "I don't need your apology, Mike. We've all paid the price for what happened." He seemed taken aback, maybe expecting me to lash out or hang up, but I just didn't have it in me. I was done with holding on to anger. It felt like a part of my life that I'd finally outgrown. After that call, I felt something shift inside me, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I realized that I was no longer tied to Beth, to Mike, or even to the pain they'd caused. I was free. Free to rebuild. Free to live without the shadows of the past haunting every decision I made. As time went on, I started finding myself again, rediscovering hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnecting with friends, even opening up to the idea of dating again. I took things slow, focusing on being present with my kids, showing them that while love can hurt, it can also heal. I wanted them to grow up knowing that life goes on, that even the deepest wounds can eventually fade. One evening, I sat down with Jack and Olivia to look through some old family photos. They asked questions about when they were babies, about memories they were too young to remember. I showed them photos of the vacations we'd taken, the holidays we'd celebrated. I even shared a few stories about Beth, the woman she was before everything fell apart. I didn't want them to grow up hating their mother, despite everything that had happened. They didn't need to know all the details, but they deserved to know the truth, that their family had once been built on love, even if it hadn't lasted. As I closed the photo album that night, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. I'd faced the past, allowed myself to grieve, and, finally, I was ready to move forward. For the first time, I felt whole again. Months passed, and I slowly started to feel more like myself. Jack and Olivia were thriving, adjusting to our new life as a team of three. They were resilient, stronger than I'd ever realized. We had our routines, movie nights, Saturday morning pancakes, bedtime stories. Those small moments of laughter, of shared joy, reminded me that I was doing something right. I was giving them a home, a foundation, and that mattered more than anything. Then, one rainy afternoon, as I was finishing up some work from home, I got another unexpected call. This time, it wasn't from Beth or Mike, but from her mother. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce, as she'd sided with Beth back then, convinced that her daughter had left me for her own happiness. She spoke softly, almost as if afraid of how I'd react. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Alex," she began, "but Beth isn't doing well. I thought you should know." My heart clenched at the news, but I kept my voice steady. "What's going on?" I asked, though a part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. There was too much history, too many scars. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut, that part of me that still remembered the woman I'd once loved. "She's in the hospital," her mother said, her voice cracking. "Her illness has progressed. It's not looking good." There was silence on the line, a silence heavy with words unsaid. "Beth has been asking for you," she finally added, and her words cut through me like a knife. I didn't know what to say. She was asking for me? After all these years? I sat there, staring at the phone, replaying everything that had happened between us. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect myself from reopening wounds that had barely healed. But the other part, the part that remembered Beth not as my ex-wife, but as the mother of my children, the woman who'd once been my best friend, knew I couldn't ignore this. Later that evening, I told Jack and Olivia that I needed to visit someone from the past. I didn't give them too many details, just enough to let them know I'd be back soon. I didn't know what I was hoping to find by going to see Beth. Closure, maybe, or understanding. Or perhaps I just needed to finally let go of the hurt that had haunted me for so long. When I walked into her hospital room, I barely recognized her. She was thinner, her face pale, her eyes tired. But when she saw me, her face softened, a flicker of the old Beth shining through. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I moved closer, taking a seat beside her bed. For a moment, we just looked at each other. The years of pain, regret, and love stretching between us in silence. "I didn't think you'd come," she finally said, her voice tinged with sadness. I shrugged, trying to keep my emotions in check. You asked for me. I looked down at my hands, not sure what to say next. Why now, Beth? Why call me after all this time? She closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. I've been holding on to so much guilt, Alex. I tried to bury it, to pretend it didn't matter, but her voice broke, and she opened her eyes, tears glistening. I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry for everything. I know I ruined everything, and I can't undo it, but I need you to understand. I did love you. I loved you more than I knew how to handle. Hearing her say those words after all these years, after everything we'd been through, brought a surge of emotions I wasn't prepared for. Part of me felt anger, resentment, wanting to tell her it was too late. But another part of me, a deeper part, felt the weight of her apology, the sincerity in her voice. It was like seeing a glimpse of the woman I'd loved, the woman who had once been my whole world. Beth? I said softly, struggling to keep my voice steady. We both made mistakes. You should have told me the truth back then. We could have faced it together. But that's the past. I can't change what happened, and neither can you. I sighed, feeling a strange sense of peace as the words left my mouth. But I forgive you, not because it erases what you did, but because I need to let it go, for both of us. She looked at me, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you, Alex. I don't deserve it, but thank you. She reached out, and I took her hand, feeling the frailty in her grip. We sat like that, in silence, the weight of years melting away, leaving behind only the quiet understanding of two people who had once loved each other deeply. As I left the hospital that night, I felt lighter. The anger, the bitterness. It wasn't gone, but it had softened, replaced by a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. I could finally move on, not just with my life, but with my heart. After my visit with Beth, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about how shattered I'd felt when she left, how lost and betrayed. But I'd rebuilt myself, found strength in my pain, and forged a new life for me and the kids. And now, with the weight of Beth's apology, with her truth finally laid bare, I could let go of the past without bitterness. A few weeks later, I got the news that Beth had passed away. I felt an unexpected sadness, a quiet sorrow that had nothing to do with anger or regret. I grieved not just for her, but for what we'd lost, for the family that had once been whole. I explained to Jack and Olivia as gently as I could, and we had a small gathering to remember the good moments, to honor the love that had once brought us together. I wanted them to know that despite everything, their mother had been someone worth remembering. In the months that followed, I poured my heart into being present for my kids, into giving them a life filled with love, security, and hope. I wanted them to know that while life isn't always fair, while it can be filled with heartbreak and loss, there is always room for forgiveness, for healing. I started dating again, carefully and slowly. I didn't want to rush, but I was finally open to the possibility of love, a love free from the shadows of the past. It felt strange at first, letting someone new into my life, but with each small step, I felt more alive, more ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. Looking back, I realized that Beth's betrayal had once defined me, shaped the way I saw myself and the world. But now, with time and forgiveness, I was no longer the man shaped by her choices. I was my own person, a father, a friend, a man who had walked through fire and come out stronger, wiser. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone facing betrayal, it would be this: don't let it harden you. Don't let it steal your ability to love, to trust. There will be scars, yes, but those scars don't have to define you. Allow yourself to feel, to heal, and to forgive, not for the person who hurt you, but for yourself. As I tucked Jack and Olivia into bed that night, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For my kids, for the lessons I'd learned, for the life I was still building. And I knew, as I closed their bedroom door, that whatever came next, I was ready to face it, with an open heart and a soul finally free. Life has a way of moving on, even after it feels like the world has collapsed around you. Months turned into years, and the sharp edges of my past with Beth began to soften, becoming part of my story but no longer defining it. Jack and Olivia grew into teenagers, and watching them navigate life filled me with pride. They were resilient, compassionate, and filled with a curiosity for the world that reminded me that, even through heartbreak, we'd managed to build something beautiful together. In time, I found myself drawn to someone new. Her name was Emma, a friend of a friend, someone I'd met at a casual gathering. She was warm, thoughtful, and easy to be around in a way that didn't feel forced or complicated. With her, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't allowed myself to in years. We took things slowly, letting trust build between us one small moment at a time. There were no grand gestures, no rush to define what we were. Just a quiet, steady kind of companionship that filled the empty spaces in my life, slowly turning into something I could call love. The first time I introduced Emma to Jack and Olivia, I was nervous, not knowing how they'd react. But Emma, with her gentle approach and open heart, won them over almost immediately. She became someone they looked up to, a trusted friend they could turn to in ways that I hadn't expected. Watching her with them, seeing the way she respected our little family and found her place within it, I realized that this was what I'd been waiting for. A love that didn't erase the past but added to the life we'd already built. As the years passed, Emma and I grew closer, and though we never rushed into anything, our relationship deepened. I began to see a future with her, a possibility of happiness I hadn't dared to believe in before. She understood my story, my wounds, and my journey, and she embraced it all. She became a part of our family, in every sense of the word. She respected Beth's memory, knowing that Beth was still a part of Jack and Olivia's lives. But she also understood that our family had grown beyond the hurt, had moved forward with love and resilience. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Emma reached for my hand. "I love this life we're building together, Alex," she said softly, looking at me with that warm smile that had slowly become the anchor in my world. "I know it's been a journey to get here, but I wouldn't trade any of it." I squeezed her hand, my heart full of gratitude. "Me neither," I replied, feeling a deep peace settle over me. For the first time, I felt like I was truly home, like I'd finally found a love built on trust, understanding, and acceptance. Years ago, I'd believed that Beth's betrayal would haunt me forever, that it would shape every relationship, every decision I made. But as I sat there, hand in hand with Emma, I realized that the wounds had healed, and the scars were just reminders of how far I'd come. Life, with all its pain and beauty, had brought me to this moment. A new beginning filled with love, laughter, and a future I could finally look forward to with an open heart. For those who find themselves in the depths of heartbreak, feeling as though they'll never find their way out, I would say this: healing is possible. The road is long, and sometimes unbearably painful, but there is a life waiting on the other side of that pain. Hold on. Trust that love can be rebuilt, that hope can be found in unexpected places. Let yourself believe that, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes.